I'd like to begin by saying a very warm welcome to all of you and for saying thank you in advance for taking the time to join us on this very important discussion. We are meeting today to discuss one component of the technical papers that the African Center for Economic Transformation, with its partners in policy institutes across Ghana, civil society, government partners, etc., are working on to develop the Compact for Political and Economic Transformation. I'm going to go into the details of the compact because KY will give an overview of that. But given where we all are today on the continent of Africa, and in Ghana in particular, this discussion is a pertinent one for us. And it's a really important discussion in terms of some of the challenges that our leaders are having to navigate right now to ensure that the difficulties that ordinary Ghanaians are going through can be reduced over the next few years. So thank you for making time. I think we all have the structure of the program in front of us. Please let me know if, or one of my colleagues know, if you don't have a structure of the program. You don't. Yeah. You found one, Senna? Great. So please, we have the program in front of us. We are going to start first with KY's welcome speech. I'm not going to go through the whole program, as I'm going to have to introduce every single element before it starts. So we're going to start with KY's speech. So for those of you who don't know KY, which I doubt very much, I'm very pleased to welcome the president of ASET, Dr. KY Amoakon. Dr. KY Amoakon not only started ASET and the whole agenda of economic transformation on the continent, but is also the brains behind the concept of a compact for political and economic transformation to ensure that Ghanaians are united behind the Ghana we want by 2050. So on that note, I'd like to hand over to KY. KY.
Hello. Yeah, good. Thanks and welcome, everyone. I'm not going to go into any lengthy description of the compact. You all know about it. We've all been involved in the last several months, one way or the other. Some of you were at Peduase. We have partners who are working with us here. And so welcome, as you say, all protocols observed, right? In that sense, I don't have to recognize all the honorables, all protocols observed. We are here for one Ghana. Yeah, but let me give you the context of, to me, why the compact idea started and why I think it's critical. It came to me in actually 2021, March, after the 2020 election, and when we were having all sorts of issues in the country about acceptance of the results of the elections and the political challenges, and then it hit me. This can't go on forever. It can't go on forever. And it brought to me my own experience working on African development over the last 50 years, and in particular the last 20 years, including the time I was at heading the Economic Commission for Africa, and some of the things I focused on. And I said, no, this can't go on. And the basic cause of the problems in Ghana and in many other African countries, but in particular in our own country, were three. The political polarization, that's in our multi-party democracy over the last, since the Fourth Republic, has really held us back. Well, and it's getting worse. And that election and the outcome clearly demonstrated that. The second is, Mavis just mentioned my work on economic transformation and how I put that asset. And when I left the EC and I came to start asset, it was all about the experience I had. We talked about poverty reduction, we talked about MDGs, and Africa wasn't going anywhere. So I said, we need to change the paradigm. Unless we transform our economies, we can't meet the MDGs, we can't meet the SDGs. And what's preventing us? So let's change the paradigm and focus on economic transformation. So we've been through a whole process, international, within Africa, pushing the economic transformation agenda. I won't go into all that now. And our poor record as Ghana on economic transformation is also related to the political polarization and a few other stuff. I won't go into all that. And later on in the discussion today, I think we come back to Ghana's record on economic transformation compared to other African countries, which has not been great. So that's the thing. And the third challenge is the threat to our democracy. The threat to our democracy that we have seen, and increasingly with the frustration of people, and also as a result of political polarization, there's threats to our democracy. And each time I talk about democracy in Africa, people say, oh, well, hey, all this democracy stuff. Some other countries where you have a strong man or a strong woman, we don't have in there. I hope one day we'll get a strong woman. Maybe that may change things. And I say, democracy, and in fact, if you see what's happening around the world today, in the US and all that, maybe the people who don't believe in democracy may be proven right, but I hope not. But as we said in one of our papers, democracy may not guarantee the best of governance outcomes, but it prevents the worst from happening. So we need to preserve our democracy, whatever we do. And to the extent, so the compact, basically I wanted to give you what, let us propose this. That's the diagnosis of the problem. So the compact is trying to deal with these problems. And what the compact is about, as you know in the papers, you've read the papers, so I won't go into them. It's about some binding constraints, constitution, fiscal, and that's why we are here on the fiscal, and of our planning process and continuity. That's what I would say on that. And then we've also identified a lot of specific thematic areas where we think, but the other thing I forgot to say is very important. Everybody's focusing on 2024 elections, 2024, NDC, MPP, CPP, I hope, and others will also come in strong. But my promise, my stance is very simple. We will elect a government in 2024, December, and I hope it's going to be peaceful. But once we do, the new president will take the oath of office, January 2025, which to me is a very significant time or date. It's the beginning of the second quarter of the 21st century. Think about it. We've had 25 years already of this century. And when the century was turning 22, you remember? 2000, hey, a new century, everything is going to be, yeah. Where are we after 25 years, in particular in this country? So I say to you, the next 25 years, after January 2025, you're going to make or break for this country. Why? All these factors, the youth issue in particular, the frustration, issues of climate change. So unless we can tackle those issues seriously, the future of this country, the future of our children, the future of our grandchildren will be at stake. So that is what this whole thing is about, put in that context. And therefore, we've identified some thematic areas that we think these 25 years is going to be critical for the security, for securing this country's future. Gender equality, I won't say more than that. Youth, education and skills, private sector development, and climate. There could be others, but these are the areas that we have put on the agenda. So the compact tries to deal with these, help us set goals, build a consensus, and get our leaders to address this issue. So I think it's important we understand why this is all about. So I wanted to stress that. And then we hope to set some goals and targets that future governments will be consistently pursuing. And we stop this back and forth, that we don't make progress. So that's the other point I wanted to stress. And we've had some discussions, and those of you who were in Peduasi, remember the issue of values came up, and the mindset. And people say, we say all these things, we blame politicians, we do this, but fundamentally, it's about we as the people. It's about our mindset, it's about our values. We talk about corruption, lack of accountability, it all bounds to values. So it's not just the politicians, it's about all of us. So unless we address those issues consistently, and they are difficult, so there are some ideas, and we put a team together to look into that. I think later this month, we're going to have a special session. And even at Peduasi, some ideas came up. Working with the NCC, National Center for Civic Education, and others, to bring the issues of values, especially the young people. So I just wanted to put that also on the agenda, the values. Okay, so that is the why and the what. Let me talk a bit about the process going forward. So we're preparing all these papers, and this consultation together is important. And later on in the day, Mavis will come in and tell us the next steps, particularly through the compact after this discussion. So I won't go into any of that. I wanted to say consultation. I'm glad that we have worked with. We've gone around, met with the chief, the Council of State, and Chris Sam is here. They've been extremely supportive of what we're trying to do. We've met with them 4 times, separate times. That's a record. So that's, and they see the great importance of this. So I'm very honored, very pleased to see you, Uncle Sam, and Nana Utosrobo, and all of you who have been so encouraging. I personally could have given up very easily without the support of the council and the attention the council has given to us. We've met with religious leaders, we met with the TUC, IGI, all some key stakeholders, and that's also very encouraging. But today I want to stress the importance of the partnership with the think tanks, probably the institutions who are working with us. So this paper before you is not us. It's ISA, it's IFS. They did the original paper draft that we've all pulled together. And the same goes for all this. So the partners are Imani, IDEC, ISA, IFS, CDD. That's right. And in particular, I want to thank the Director General for NDPC for being here with us today. I mean, your presence here and the support you've given us in the planning process and the work we've done together, I think it's critical to bring this continue. So planning is very important, and the NDPC partnership, I wanted to stress that. So those are the issues. Later, and we have some partnerships on civil society organizations. That will be important for the next stage of the consultation, which I'm sure maybe we should go. Among development partners, we haven't brought in development partners at all. We think this should be a Ghanaian-driven agenda. It should be driven by us. And the results, when they come out in the process, they can then ride around that. So we've been very, very clear on that from the process. I've made one exception. The World Bank Country Director may be here today because of the issues we are discussing and the importance of it. The IMF rep was going to come, but he's so busy. Also because no, there's not going to be any development partner here today other than the World Bank. Then the political parties. Whatever we do, politics is important. And our political parties and parliamentarians and others are the ones who should set the goals for the implementation. So all this, so getting the political parties to understand, appreciate what we're doing, and get their input into the process is critical. That's why I'm glad to see our Green Street here, a couple of others. Nana Yajantua was going to come also. I don't see her yet. So she may also join us. And as you know, we've said the program, the chair of the finance committee and the ranking member of parliament were supposed to be here, and I'm sure they will come. They are very busy right now, so they probably will be late coming in. But yeah, so I want the political parties to be part of the process. Sometime in January, I think we have an inter-party dialogue where we're going to bring all the leaders of all the political parties, the chairman and the general secretaries, to a special session so that we can explain to them what all this means for the future of this country. So that's all I will say, but for the consultations today, in particular on the fiscal, it's critical and it's timely. You all know what's going on, so it's very timely. And I thank our colleagues from IFS and ISA in particular for all the work they've done to help us prepare this report. So it's very important. I mentioned the IMF. Having been to the IMF 17 times, it's a disgrace. It's a disgrace. I talk about lack of economic transformation, but when you look at that, and we need to avoid going there for the 18th time. So the issues in this paper, clearly, if you can address them. The point I want to say, if you look at the paper and the origin, it spans the whole last, 40 years or so? Or 30 or whatever of the Fourth Republic. All the governments, all administrations have contributed to the challenges, the fiscal response, some more so than others. But you cannot blame any particular government, any particular party. So we are on this together. We are responsible for this over time. So let this discussion be in that spirit. It's in that spirit of a consensus. It's not about NDC, it's not about MPP. It's about us. And as Mona Korte told me the other day, Honorable says it's one Ghana. It's about one Ghana. So it's in that spirit of one Ghana that I really thank you for coming, my friends, brothers and sisters. And let's have a good discussion. And the results of this discussion, I'm sure, can influence even the budget coming up. There are some short-term issues that hopefully they will say, okay, we hadn't thought about this. That'll be a great win. And also the fund program, and all that. But fundamentally, many of these issues are long-term. We can't address them overnight. But if we have clarity and focus on that, we won't go to the IMF for an 18th program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, KY. As KY said in his welcome remarks, the Compact is not an asset program. It's a partnership program. It's a program that is being developed in partnership with a range of stakeholders. And in all of our technical consultations, we are also developing the technical consultations in partnership with others. So the first one we did on the private sector, we did it in partnership with AGI, and the president is here. This one is being done in partnership with the Parliamentary Finance Committee. The honorable members are not here to do their introductory remarks. So what I'd like to propose we do is we go to the next agenda, and when they are able to join us, we will give them a chance to speak. So at this point, I'd like to invite my colleague, Dr. John Asafwaje. John is a senior economist at the African Center for Economic Transformation, and John is going to give us an overview of the paper.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. So it's a pleasure for me to go over the technical paper that we've submitted, and I hope you've had a chance to look at it, but if not, I'll just go over the highlights. And as KY said, and as Mavis said, this paper draws from the technical paper that was commissioned for the compact and co-authored by ISA and IFS, but we've also taken some additional sources from other places to present what we are presenting. So the technical paper itself that was authored by IFS and ISA will be put on the compact website, and we hope that people will use it as a resource. So this morning, I just want to briefly go over the highlights, and I'll start with some introductory remarks. Ghana's poor fiscal outcomes since the start of the Fourth Republic can be manifest in various characteristics. And one of these is the large fiscal deficits. I'm trying to operate this from the back, but if it doesn't work, then it's working, okay. All right. So the first one is we've had large fiscal deficits. So for example, in this period, since the Fourth Republic, we've seen an average fiscal deficit of 6.3% of GDP over this period, and this has spiked during election years, with an average of 8.1% of GDP in election years compared to 5.6% outside of election years. Secondly, we've seen frequent sharp debt buildups. HIPC brought us some relief, but the debt levels we're seeing now is actually of pre-HIPC proportions. And alongside the growing debt, we've seen growing rapid growth in debt servicing costs. So just to give you an example, in 2021, debt service was 70.1% of total revenue and grants. And interest payment was 44% of total revenue and grants. So with all these money going into debt servicing and interest payment, obviously there's been very little left for investment. So we've seen a decline in total public investment. This has fallen from 48.4% in 2008 to 18.1% in 2021. So the paper that has been done identifies three main causes. One is the low domestic revenue that we've witnessed. Secondly, we have expenditure challenges with high debt levels and high debt service burden. So what I'm going to do is I'll briefly discuss issues in each of these four areas and then put forward the recommendations that we've come up with. And hopefully in the breakout sessions, we're going to get more from you in terms of what should be added or what should be expanded and so forth. So that's the main purpose of the exercise. So let me start with domestic revenue mobilization. And this could be a challenge. Okay, next slide, please, Eben, if you can help me. Yeah, so there's been several reforms in revenue administration since 2001. I wouldn't like to go through all of them, but the key one has been the reforms in the GRA Act 2009, which merged the SEPS, IRS, and VAT service into one agency. But despite these reforms, we've seen a decline in total revenue. So total revenue, excluding grants, declined from 18.1% of GDP in 2001 to 14.7% in 2019. And this is despite economic growth. So over this period, we've seen an average growth of 6.2% in GDP. And yet we're witnessing decline in revenues. So we attribute this to a number of factors. One is that there's been lack of sustained growth. So we've had spikes in GDP growth, but that has not been sustained, especially non-GDP growth, the non-oil GDP growth, which is very important for revenue generation. Secondly, we have a narrow tax base. Only 2.4 million people out of a workforce of about 40 million pay direct taxes. Thirdly, there's limited revenue from extractives, and we've seen this over the years. Ghana gets less revenue from extractives than its African peers, and I've got a few statistics just to give you an idea. So, for example, Ghana's extractive sector revenue as a share of extractive value added is only 19.3% around 2020, compared to 54.2% for middle-income countries and 50.9% for a sample of African countries. Fourth, we have the generous tax exemptions. So in the past, these tax exemptions have not delivered the dividends that we expected. The 2019 exemptions bill was finally passed in July this year, but there's still some CSOs who believe that the current bill still gives too much discretion to the Minister of Finance and Cabinet to give tax exemptions. The fifth is revenue leakage. Governments since the Fourth Republic have struggled with this issue. A study by ASODEC, and I was expecting one of them to be here, estimates that Ghana loses about $2 billion annually from tax evasion from companies, multinationals, individuals, and so forth. And one such place where there's potential loss of revenue is the Tema port. Despite implementation of state-of-the-art scanners and AI being used to inspect all these containers, almost all the containers are still being physically examined at the port. And data shows that physical examination of these containers contributes about 0.4% to tax revenue from the ports. So the recommendations we come up with, next slide, please. So we've got short-term and long-term recommendations. In the short term, these are things that can be done right away. The longer-term ones need further study and need further consultation. So the first one is that there's a need to effectively enforce the tax laws, to aggressively go after tax evaders and tax avoiders. Secondly, there's a need to simplify the tax system to make it understandable to citizens. There's a need to scale up public education and awareness for people to understand the tax system. I know the Vice President is talking about digitalization, which is in the right direction, but we would like to see a more rapid rollout of online payment systems to enable those with access to the internet to pay their taxes. There's a need to improve tax audits and compliance management. There's the need to streamline the agencies operating at the ports. And in the medium term, and maybe right now, there's talk about property taxes. I believe the government has been working on this. There's a need to rapidly roll out the platform for collecting property taxes. In the medium to long term, we should look at the extractive sector, and hopefully sections will get some ideas from you in terms of how this could be done. Next slide, please. I go to expenditure management. And again, there are a number of challenges that I've listed them. I'll quickly go over each of them. The first one is fiscal rigidities. We define this as institutional, legal, contractual, and other constraints that limit the government's ability to change the size and the structure of the budget. So examples are, one, high earmarked or rigid expenditures, which is due to statutory funds, due to rising employee compensation, and of course the ballooning public debt service which the government needs to pay. So just to give you an idea, in 2013 to 2020, total earmark expenditure or rigid expenditure as a ratio of total grants and revenues was over 100% in this period. So for example, in 2020, it was 140%. This means that the government had to borrow additional amounts just to meet its financial obligations. The second one is what we refer to as fiscal populism. So we define this as the pursuit of fiscal policies which is aimed at attracting popular support to win elections. So for a government in power, this could lead to overspending, especially in election years. It could also result in poorly implemented programs or even non-viable projects. The third is revenue leakage. And here, let me refer to the Auditor General's report. It shows that Ghana loses huge sums of money from financial malpractices and irregularities in the public institutions. So just to give you an example, between 2016 and 2020, cumulative losses amounted to 13.3 billion Ghana cedis. And the latest report, which is the 2021 report for the financial year ending 2021, shows that there's lack of control in expenditures due mainly to the MDAs and MMDAs not following the public financial management regulations. So one example is, for example, many of these MDAs and especially MMDAs did not use the Ghana International Financial Integrated Financial Information Management System, which meant that they were able to do irregular things. So the Attorney and the Auditor General has also failed to go after these individuals and companies in terms of maybe surcharging them or even proposing some of them for prosecution. Next is the operation of state-owned enterprises. And here I'll quote from the 2020 State Ownership Report. It shows that government's fiscal exposure in terms of amounts committed to these SOEs in 2020 was 21,531 million Ghana cedis. And the Auditor General's report for 2021 shows that the cost of financial irregularities was 17.483 billion Ghana cedis. So clearly, this is an area where attention is required. Lastly, I'd like to look at domestic arrears. Domestic arrears, and then I'll come to extra budgetary expenditures. So government owes the private sector huge sums of money. And of course, we know this negatively impacts the private sector. It also indirectly affects the informal sector as well. Some studies say that the impact on the informal sector is probably even greater. So just to give you an example, the Ghana Chamber of Construction and Industry claims recently that the government owes them 10 billion Ghana cedis over the past 5 years. Coming to extra budgetary expenditures, we see that this often happens after the budget is read and passed by Parliament, and this displaces programs which have been funded in the budget. It also contributes to accumulation of arrears, and obviously it can lead to fraud and irregularity. Let's look at the policy recommendations. Next slide, please. In the short term, government can strengthen fiscal governance and reduce corruption by sending a strong signal of zero tolerance for corruption. And here, the government needs to surcharge public servants from overspending, who have overspent. It needs to prosecute those who have been found to engage in fraudulent behavior. Secondly, there's a need to tighten expenditure controls and also for timely reporting. And with the MMDAs and MDAs, there's a need to insist that they use the GIF MIS platform. Going forward, the government can assess the main governance weaknesses and corruption vulnerabilities to inform policy. In terms of reducing government expenditures, there needs to be better targeting of public investment. And here we are suggesting that the government should review some of the flagship programs, maybe postpone or cancel some, and going forward, there's the need for a critical evaluation, especially of subsidies in the agricultural sector, which we know that some of it has ended up across the border. In the medium to long term, government can reduce the budget rigidity I spoke about, one, by reducing the size of earmark expenditure. I know this is hard to do, but the government can review the existing earmark funds and scrap some of them. Secondly, the government can reduce compensation bill ratio, make it comparable to our middle-income peers in Africa. So, for example, in 2015, Ghana's compensation bill as a ratio of total government expenditure was about 37%, nearly 37%, compared to 26.5% for a sample of 22 African countries. So clearly, it has to do with the issue of productivity in the public service. Thirdly, the government can progressively reduce debt service expenditure, and this would be in line with the program for the IMF, where there should be targets of reducing debt service, which is currently the biggest item in the budget. In the medium to long term, when it comes to fiscal populism, we are recommending that the government should require all governments to implement a nationally agreed long-term development. So this is work that has been done by the planning team. So this links to that work which is being done by the NDPC. And the Fiscal Responsibility Act, we can make it more effective. So some are suggesting, for example, that the Fiscal Council should be made truly independent. As it is, the council is appointed by the government, and there's a belief that they are not truly independent. Let me go to the last but one factor, which is negative economic shock. Next slide, please. So we define negative economic shocks as unexpected events that occur impact on the economy. So example would be the energy sector shocks, which we had in the 1990s, late 2000, due to drought, whereby we had problems with energy generation. The global financial crisis in 2007 is another example. Of course, we have the COVID-19, and now we have the Ukraine war. So what can be done? In the short run, I think we believe that if the government can build strong fiscal buffers, especially in good times, this can help to address some of the negative shocks during the bad times. We haven't built up the Ghana Stabilization Fund. Currently, I believe is empty. But we need to build these strong buffers, and we need to establish similar funds for other commodities, cocoa, bauxite, gold, manganese. Regarding oil, we need to review the Petroleum Revenue Management Act to insist that there should be a minimum amount in the GSF, and this should be clearly specified. In the long term, we believe that the best way to address these negative shocks is to build a resilient economy that enables faster recovery. So this is what Asset calls growth with depth, but I wouldn't like to go into that now, but that could be a solution in the long run. Finally, let's look at debt sustainability. Next slide, please. So to date, we know that Ghana has suffered a series of credit downgrades, and this has effectively shut out the government from the international capital markets. And this is because of the market's concerns about the high government interest cost and the low revenues, and the likelihood that the IMF intervention will require some form of debt treatment. So the IMF Bank did a debt sustainability analysis last year and classified the country as at high risk of debt distress. We know the new DSA is ongoing, and if the debt levels are found to be unsustainable, it means that we will need to have debt restructuring. In fact, some numbers that came in just yesterday shows that the T-bill rates have reached its highest levels in 10 years. So this has increased the risk that the domestic debt will be unsustainable. So there's a very strong chance that Ghana will have to restructure its debts. And we believe that both domestic and external debt will need to be restructured if debt levels are found to be unsustainable. So on the external debt, Eurobonds will be very key because Eurobonds currently comprise around 50% of Ghana's external debt. As at the end of 2020, the Eurobonds stood at 13.1 billion. Domestic debt is also an issue because domestic debt constitutes 75% of the government's annual debt repayment burden. And commercial banks hold about 30% of the debt, and 31% of the banking sector assets are held by the commercial banks as of 2021. So there's a real risk that restructuring of domestic debt could easily spread to banks, pension funds, individuals, and maybe flow on to parts of the economy if it's not well handled. So the last bit is the extra budgetary borrowing before I come to the recommendations. This has negative implications for sustainability of our debt. And we define extra budgetary borrowing as borrowing by the government to fund quasi-activities of SOEs or special purpose vehicles, such as in the energy and cocoa sectors. And any default in these sectors will fall to the government, since the government is the main backer of these companies. So let's look at the recommendations. Next slide, please. To minimize the adverse impacts of the debt restructuring, which hopefully we can discuss some more during the breakout sessions, we think that the government needs to can gain commercial investor confidence by developing measures to mitigate any losses to banks, pension funds, and households, and also to ensure that the process is transparent and fair, which will reduce the cost of any litigation which might come up. And then the government needs to build consensus around the entire program by involving stakeholders. This model was done was used in Jamaica and Barbados a few years ago. In the medium to long term, government can enhance debt sustainability by, first of all, amending the Fiscal Responsibility Act to include a debt rule. So, for example, it could be a debt ceiling as a percentage of GDP. And in terms of the impacts on the implications for the debt, the government could increase the issuance of longer-term installments and broaden the investor base to reduce the currency and refinancing risk. So I think I'll stop here, and I think the next stage is if you have any questions on this presentation, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for successfully squeezing into 20 minutes a very rich paper. So I just wanted to make one quick announcement before we go into the Q&A. And the question and answers are just questions for clarification, because we'll have an opportunity to go into a lot more detail during the panel discussion as well as the breakout sessions. So 2 quick announcements before then. Firstly, I know in KY's note, he said that this was Chatham House rules and there'd be no media. Some of you have seen my dear brother Ben join us. He's not here as media. He is here as a technical partner in this conversation, and the Chatham House rules still apply. So welcome, Ben. Lovely to see you. And then the second point is we are just about catching up on time. So for your questions for clarification, if I may respectfully ask that you make your question as brief as possible, because we will have a chance to go into a lot more detail on questions. So the floor is open. Wow, that's an excellent paper, if there are no questions for clarification.
Oh, there's a question over there.
Thank you very much, Mavis. Good morning. Techua Menu. It's not really a question. There was, I'm trying to find it. There was one of the examples, but the date, it was a bit dated, and I was wondering whether there were, because you just, in your presentation, you just showed some updated figures. So there's one where the data is from 2015, and I thought that was a bit old for now. I'm trying to find it in the paper, but
yes, I think it's the compensation bill.
Yes, maybe.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So that was the earliest that they could get because of lack of data. So and because this, so data is generally a challenge, and I believe the team couldn't update it to the latest one. Yeah, so I do admit that it's a little bit dated, but it just gives you an idea that even if it was 37% in 2015, it's going to be higher now because it keeps rising.
Thank you, Prof. And if you're asking a question, could you please also introduce yourself, as we didn't have an opportunity to introduce ourselves during the discussion before we started. Any other questions? Oh, okay.
So, thank you very much. So my name is Robert Osei from the University of Ghana. Mm-hmm. So 2 quick questions. One is a clarification. In terms of those revenue efforts dropping from around 18 to 13 or so %, to what extent is the rebasing of the GDP accounting for that? Because I'm sure it does account for part of that drop. The second question relates to the issue about increasing or establishing funds. how do we reconcile that with the need to improve flexibility in our fiscals? Because one of the challenges that, and I think you also mentioned in some part of your presentation, associated with the budgets is the lack of flexibility. And part of that flexibility is engendered by these funds. So establishing new funds also will more or less impact on this flexibility. So if you could comment on that. Thank you very much.
Yes, so thank you. So we do have a longer series dating back because the revenue period I gave was, I think, 2001 to 2019. But even if you go back further, and I do have older data, remember this technical paper only looked at the Fourth Republic. But if you go further, you can see that revenues have not been going up. They've either been declining for the last 30 years or been stagnant, in some places declining. And so it's not just in the last 2 decades. It goes much further if you can look at more historic data. So the point is, given the rapid growth we've had since Ghana discovered oil, which was where there's a pickup in growth, of course, it's all commodity driven. So in some years, for example, 2011, we had 14% growth, which was well leading. That dropped after about 5 years, and so it's been going up and down. The trend in general has been quite flat or negative or since independence. So that's that. So personally, I don't think the rebasing, if it had an effect, it wouldn't have been very significant. The second question is a good one because I think it's tricky in terms of the rigidity of the expenditures, as you mentioned, but that needs to be, and I know that it's not easy to do. So that's why we put it in the long-term bucket. But I think in the long run, government should be given some flexibility, which more advanced countries are able to do in terms of changing the size and the structure of the budget. At the moment, it's very difficult for government to act given these rigidities. So I mean, again, this is something that we can deliberate further in the plenary, in the discussion breakout sessions. So I hope I've addressed your concerns.
So Chidi, you wanted to add to it?
Well, I've had the benefit of also looking at the longer paper, the more technical paper. And John, in the longer paper, there is actually an acknowledgement that the rebasing did have an impact, without a doubt. But I think the point still remains that the revenue effort, hasn't been very high. But you're right.
Thank you very much. So if we have we have one more question over there.
So Al-Hassan Idrisu, Ministry of Finance. Just 2 quick comments, not really a question, but just to clarify some 2 points. So I'm saying two quick comments to clarify some 2 points that were made. So it's not really a question.
Okay.
So the first one is that I think in your submission, you alluded to that the stabilization fund, you believe, has nothing in it. Just a correction.
Okay.
So the Ghana Stabilization Fund, as we speak today, has a threshold of $100 million. So the minimum that fund holds is $100 million. And because by law, that's by the PRMA, transfers from the stabilization fund over and above the threshold should go into the sinking fund and the contingency fund. And those transfers are made on quarterly basis. At any point in time, the amount in the fund is actually more than the $100 million. So the point I'm trying to make is that it's not correct to say that there is nothing in it. So at least as we speak today, we have 100 million US dollars in the stabilization fund. So that's the first clarification or, sorry, correction I wanted to make.
Okay.
And then secondly, just for your information, I think there was a question on compensation data. Just to direct you to the Ministry of Finance website. Periodically we post data on the website. As I speak with you now, we have fiscal data on the website up to the first half year of 2022. In fact, immediately we presented the mid-year review to the budget. We posted the fiscal figures on our website. And we usually post the fiscal data on the website with a lag of 6 weeks. So, so what that means is that it takes just about 1.5 months or 2 months maximum for you to get data on preceding periods. So as I speak with you now, you have data up to 2020, end of 2021 and first half year of 2022. So if you're not getting compensation data, please visit the Ministry of Finance website. So I don't think that it's correct to say that there's a problem in assessing fiscal data to do your compensation ratios. So the data is available. It's available to everyone.
Point of order.
Yeah.
Actually,
So,
I was not doubting that it was trying to get the comparative figures. That was the point I was interested in. It wasn't just about what is available in Ghana, but how Ghana's compares to the regional or sub-regional average. Thank you. So there's no contradiction.
Can I make a quick suggestion, please? Gentlemen and lady, if I may humbly request that you move up a bit. We have more guests coming so that they can sit on this side, if that's okay with you. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Alasan. I stand to be corrected. So thank you for confirming that we do have $100 million in the GSF. And on the compensation data, well, thank you also for making us aware that it's more recent data. So I'll relay this to the team, and if maybe they can update the figures.
Yeah, the stabilization fund, the reason why we happen to have just $100 million, and I'm using just because we have a windfall in oil revenue this year. And half year 2021, as of June 2022, we have received oil revenue that has never been received in this country since 2011, only half year, $731 million, amounting to about 5.2 billion cedis. And we have capped stabilization fund to only $100 million. And just as you said in your presentation, in fiscal management, the best thing you can do is to be able to prepare yourself in good times. So are we able to save enough from our own resources to mitigate the next crisis? And I think that's not good enough. So we have to really do something about it. And I think maybe it's time to scrap the scrapping policy by itself, or maybe we have to move it to a little bit higher. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so at this point, John, thank you very much. I think those are all the questions that we have right now. I would like to invite our moderator for the next section, Chidi Chikata. So Chidi is a former division chief at the IMF, and Chidi has also been the peer reviewer for all the technical work that has been done thus far on the fiscal paper. So he has been actively involved in the process over the last 6 to 12 months. So Chidi, thank you very much, and over to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Mavis. Why don't I'll invite the panelists to come up, and we're not going to stand on ceremonies. We're not going to read huge CVs and resumes, but we'll introduce them briefly, and you will understand why we have them here when I start. So we'll start with Miss Mona Kwote, who used to be a deputy finance minister. So she's been in the kitchen where all the fiscal food is cooked. So Mona, please join us. Join me, I should say. And then Ninoy Ashon, who is a senior advisor in the Ministry of Finance and has been both a deputy minister and a minister of state in the Ministry of Finance. So he's also been there, done that. And oh, I should add that he's also a member of the Fiscal Council, since we've been talking about the Fiscal Council. So he might have something to share with us there. Then we have Tony, my dear friend Tony Otinjesi, my classmate actually from Legon. Strictly, he doesn't need any introduction, but he's currently the chairman of the Ghana Revenue Authority. So we're going to prepare him with questions about what's happening with the revenue. So Tony, welcome Tony. Then we have an old colleague and dear friend, Fred Kwashi, who is he's just retired from being a senior economic advisor to the government of Rwanda. He's a veteran from the Ghana ERP, Economic Reform Program days of the 1980s. We were fellow combatants in that battle. And Fred has been working in Rwanda for several years now. He's recently retired. And then Ed Brown will join us. Ed is the Senior Director at Asset, in charge of policy and practice, I believe. I hope I got that right. Yeah, thank you. Okay. So what we thought we'll do, I mean, we don't want each of you to cover the whole waterfront, as it were. Although if you have views in areas where I don't direct you to, you should feel free to pipe in as well. But I thought maybe we'll start with revenue. Okay. So, I mean, the paper is very rich. I'm not sure we're going to be able to cover everything, but we thought we'll try and get as much as we can from people who are experts in this area. They've had practical experience, for them to shed some light on some of the key issues, challenges, and proposals that are contained in the paper, so that when we go into the breakout sections, we can reflect not just what the paper contains, but also insights that our panelists have. So I'll start with the revenue side and start with Tony. I mean, first, a very general question about whether the challenges and recommendations in the policy note resonate with you. Are there areas that you think are critical but missing? I mean, again, we can focus on the revenue side. And then in terms of specific things raised, it would be great if you could talk a little bit about revenue leakages, maybe the narrow tax base, and then also what might be growth promoting or growth hindering issues and policies. Because the paper says one of the things which helps revenues grow is how the GDP overall is doing. So if you could sort of structure your comments around those.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. And thanks, GD. We have come a long way from economics department. Let me first congratulate the authors of the paper. I mean, it is obviously a very good effort and captures very succinctly the issues concerning revenue mobilization. I mean, they must have put in a lot of effort and spoken to a lot of people to get to this. The first point they make about evasion is, in my opinion, accurate. I think that there is a lot more we could do about that. And to give you an example, in recent times, just taking a detailed look at the valuation database being used by the Customs Authority has resulted, I think, since last September, in substantial increases in revenue from customs duty. And it was obvious that the database had been badly mutilated, for want of a better word. And, but it also goes to what I call some of the soft issues. Our customs laws, have been fashioned many, many years ago. And while the GRA law itself is a little more recent, I think that it is time to look at all the laws again. Of course, simplification will help if we can look at simplifying the tax laws. But even more important, I think in this day and age, we need to get into detail by way of controlling the amount of discretion which is left to tax officers. Practice notes and even work instructions to enable consistency around tax collection efforts in every area, I think has become critical. It shouldn't be that a particular officer is able to give a dramatically different ruling from another one and all still be within the law. So reform of the laws, I think, is important and critical. There's also the paper talks about the narrow tax base. There is no doubt that our tax base could be broadened. But for me, the more important thing, especially at this time, is deepening the tax base rather than merely seeking to broaden the tax base. I say this because a lot of the people who don't pay taxes in Ghana, if we were to look at them critically, will not be subject to much tax. I mean, the people, the vast majority of the people in our markets, if you look at their incomes, really, we shouldn't be chasing them. This is not to say that there aren't a small core, a group of them who are big importers, who are big market queens and all. They are there, and they should be targeted, of course. But really, to go after the average market trader, in the name of taxes, I think it's not really fair to them. And for many small business operators, even if they kept adequate records of their expenditures and what they are spending on petrol and what they are paying on rent, at the end of the day, rarely, if they kept adequate records, they may not be subject to much tax. More important, like I've said, is for us to look at the big 20% who pay 80% of the taxes, particularly the mining, the natural resource companies. I mean, these are companies who, this is Chatham House rules, but in recent detailed audits of some of them, I mean, all sorts of things are coming up. And I think that more expertise and more time spent on especially natural resource companies will yield a lot more. I also think that it's time for us to take better advantage of the what is colloquially called the digitization agenda across this nation. I mean, digitizing VAT collection and customs collection, even internal revenue processes, I think, and the GRA is doing a number of pilots across all these areas. And the results are dramatic sometimes and definitely show substantial potential, I mean, over the past. And it's all very recent. I mean, September, October, that some of these things. Because in our not paying attention to detail, for instance, we didn't realize that sometimes the law itself needed to be changed. When we first set out to try and do EVAT, some of the big traders threatened to go to court, and that the law does not allow some of the things we were trying to do. And so when we took a critical look at the laws, our legal advisors agreed. So, I mean, Parliament will agree. We had to do some amendments very fast. And it's only at the end of August that those amendments were pushed through and necessary accents obtained to start. And already some of that is starting to yield results. The unfortunate thing about it, and I suppose it's about digitization across the economy, is that as you do that, you find that you have the vast majority of your workers who are not used to digital processes. And many of them are reluctant to even learn. That's the hard fact. So you will find that in GRA, we had a core of young people who were brought in under a program called NAPCO. And so some of them became actually the digital fingers of a lot of the old staff, you know. And it leads you to wonder that in bringing in digitization, there's also a cultural element to it, you know, culture change within the organization that should be seriously addressed. Whether it's fast training, whether it's a means to get them to accept it and all. I mean, it's a kind of change management process, which we seem to forget in our quest to digitize. I think that is very, very important. The other thing I would add is that sometimes you have joint objectives which may not necessarily complement each other. And if you are not careful, some of the objectives may be used as an excuse not to do other ones. I'm talking about the relation between trade facilitation and revenue mobilization. For somebody who can use trade facilitation in the sense of getting things faster, and it is a genuine need to facilitate trade. But if in the process, revenue mobilization suffers, then you want to say, hey, hold on, let's make sure between the two, shouldn't revenue mobilization have precedence over trade facilitation? You know, so sometimes you need to make sure that, and when you have people who are not inclined to do what is best at any point. The other thing I'd like to mention is the fact that in revenue mobilization, especially when you are going after the big boys, you are dealing with organizations who have access to the best, whether in terms of finance or legal resources, lawyers and all. So unless you will find out that you get there and skills-wise alone, you are not able to match the people that you have to deal with. So continuous training and also attraction of the best minds is critical. And this is an area where when you look at public service rules of engagement and promotion and progress and all, you need to have some flexibility within a revenue organization to be able to do this. And in the 1 year since I've been overseeing this thing, I mean, chats with the best revenue organizations around the world indicates that there is that kind of flexibility if you need to find much better resources. When your lawyers sit down to talk to their lawyers, what the capacity becomes important and even critical. Yeah. One last thing, and I'll stop. Because I heard the exemptions bill mentioned this morning, and I saw it in the technical paper too. The Association of Ghana Industries made an interesting comment about the exemptions bill when there was the stakeholder engagement about it. And our president is somewhere here, is he? And I remember they mentioned in the paper that what the bill seems to do is to collate and put together all the exemptions we have been complaining about, and we have kind of codified them into a bill. So in the conclusion to that paper, if I recollect correctly, and was that we do not think, the Association of Ghana Industries does not think that that bill will lead to the result that is perceived to lead to. In fact, it might make it even easier for the people to go after the exemptions, because now it's clear to them. We thought that in an exemptions bill, you would have try to determine which exemptions are due and which should not be allowed at all. But the law, the new law doesn't seem to. But let's see it operate. We can always improve these things over time. So thank you very much.
Very helpful. You've set us off well. I'm going to ask Mona and Noe, who have been on the policy side of things, if they have some reactions on the revenue side. And then I think we do want to move to expenditure, because that's also very rich and wide-ranging. But I thought I'll give you two a chance. I mean, from sort of the policy where you've sat in the past, I mean, do you have any reflections you want to make on either the paper or what Tony has said? Who wants to go first? Yeah.
Thank you, Chidi. Hello to everyone I haven't yet said hello to. Yeah, I mean, I think Tony hit on a lot of important points. And I had told Chidi earlier that I would like to talk about non-tax revenue, and other sources of income that government also collects, because it's not just tax revenue. But just to get back on some of the things that Tony said, the valuation data base with customs, I think that has been an old problem and continues to be a problem, and it gets worse. There was, of course, a period when we were getting great revenue from customs until not too long ago, when certain changes were made in terms of how it should be processed, pre-shipment, and then actual shipment time, and then getting here. And there was also pressure from the World Trade Organization on how that process should be. If by now that valuation data is really mutilated, as mentioned by Tony, then we need to get to the stage where we should ask ourselves, what is good for us as a nation to do? There are international standards, but we should also look at our situation and find out how best. I mean, if I recall, when there were the SDGs, the MDGs, there was also the Africa 60, which pertained specifically to our situation. So I think that sometimes when international regulations come up, we should also look at our situation and make sure that it works for us, because if the process and how it sits on the ground doesn't work well, then we have a problem. I want to just bring or highlight a time when there was the need for a certain digital process to value customs duties and so forth. And there was a big hue and cry, especially during a government change. And in fact, the government that was in power at the time was so against it, and there were even some international court cases and so forth. But eventually, sitting down with the Customs Division, together with the Ministry of Finance officials, we found out that it made sense to have that valuation done in the way that it had been proposed. And we actually went back to use or to start to use that valuation process. I don't know if, as of today, that change was kept and has been used. But there are times that when you think through the practicalness of doing certain things, you find out that those things perhaps work. The soft issues that were mentioned, those continue to bug us, and I'm glad that KY raised that as the transformation, the mental transformation, the soft issues that are so difficult for us to change. The laws, of course, the reforms that need to take place, and how to simplify them, how to make them consistent is so true. But when we talk about the people who are doing the work, and when Tony raised the issue of some of them not even being teachable or not being able to even learn, it begs the question that, so for the government workers that we have, public service and civil servants, are we going to continue this old British colonial way of doing things where it's yes, Prime Minister, where we just give commands and they have to be obeyed even before a discussion is held? Or will we now open up our minds so that some of the good resource that we have within the public and civil service, especially the new ones that are coming up, the new people who are coming up with rich ideas, that we can listen to those ideas, jaw properly, rather than issue fiats and commands down? I think that we need to start opening our minds to that. And I'm not saying do away with the old, but let the new, who can handle the technology and the digital world, come to the fore. And that way, perhaps even those who were there before, who are entrenched in that culture of just obeying and not being able to have that conversation, that they will do so. So I think that that is important, trying to tie the culture bit and the process bit with all of this. The big 20% has not changed. And I agree with Tony when he says that perhaps widening may be difficult. Because honestly, I agree with him. Looking at widening, we'll just go to people who, if they kept records, you'd find out that they don't really need to pay that much. And in taxation, we have this, as it were, mantra that the cost of collection really should not exceed the amounts that you're collecting. Otherwise, it's a wasted effort. So we need to look at that carefully and look at the deepening. When it comes to the mining companies, which Tony used as an example, I'd like to say that, when it comes to the extractive sector, and I see that KY has mentioned that in his paper, and those who worked on it have also raised it. They are easily identifiable, so visibility, and you go for them. And I will give a caveat. I'm part of the mining sector. I've always been part of the mining sector. But I have to say, this is a sector that relies heavily on good infrastructure, and that is not usually found in the places where they are mining. Secondly, their capital expenditure is more, that amount is spent more offshore. Why? Because that's where the equipment that is needed, the expertise sometimes that is needed is. In terms of consumables and so forth, we've seen that the local content policy that came out and has been subsequently amended has been helpful. But we have to bear in mind that so long as the ownership of these mines, and we only keep a 10% free carry, are predominantly offshore, and procurement for a lot of the machinery and equipment is also offshore, has to come from offshore necessarily, we we must find a way of doing this rather than targeting them as if they are offenders. So I want us to be careful when we do this. We should do it, but be careful when we do it so that it's seen as being in partnership, but not because they are just visible. Because to be honest, as I move in that sector, what I hear is that for the mining companies, we are visible, it's easy to target us, it's easy to take money from us. And it's almost like government is fleecing them. Meanwhile, whether we like it or not, they contribute heavily to non-tax revenue in the area of royalties and corporate income tax and other taxes that they pay, whether it's consumption tax, VAT, and so forth, and the consultants that they use, and even taxes for their workers. So let's be careful how we handle some of these big businesses, especially the extractive sector, so that they are not made to feel like they are being fleeced, because increasingly we are hearing a lot of that from some time now, the government seems to fleece certain industries. So that's where...
Once you have the floor.
Yeah, okay. Okay. So for that, I think it's important, not only the extractive industry, but all other industries that contribute to our growth. Because we should also remember that many of these visible industries also do a lot of corporate social responsibility. In fact, sometimes we force them to do it as government. We will put pressure on them to do it. So they do contribute in many ways. And perhaps if we calculated all of that, we would have a better approach to dealing with them. In the area of non-tax revenue, again, the concept of public-private partnership came up very strongly. And I haven't heard too much recently where that has been applied. But I would wish that we would do a whole lot more of that. For example, just for example, the motorway. That was one of the projects that was on the list for public-private partnership. It lent itself to it and so forth. But we have not, all governments that have come to pass, have not been able to let this take off, except for what MPS did in collaboration with the JICA funding to improve the roads out of the port, and that was to decongest the port, to improve the road infrastructure out of the port and to the circle to meet the motorway. Unfortunately, on both sides of that big interchange, it's still the same or even worse. The roads are bad. There was the idea that there would be dedicated roads for trucks, and they would have paid for it right from the port, and then there will be more lanes. I think that if we could really try and push this agenda and come to a solution that makes it tenable, because even if it's private sector, whether it's the banks, whether it's huge investors, there has to be an ROI that makes sense. People don't put their capital where there is no return. So we have to discuss it in a way that it makes sense. Recently, when government took the tolls, which already were not adequate anyway to manage those roads and to maintain them, when they took it off, it was a big shock to most Ghanaians, because they were like, did it really matter? Should have just left it there, because what you took it off to give in place of it didn't really give the revenue that it should have. So if we can look at those again in terms of the PPP projects that are self-financing and can give the returns, we can reduce expenditure for government. Now, with respect to that same revenue section, non-tax revenue section, increasingly, a lot of the MMDAs are asking for their IGFs to stay with them, and that perhaps they can better manage it. It shouldn't go to the consolidated funds. With the building of the airport Terminal 3, we all saw that allowing them to keep their IGF and the taxes that they collect made sure that they could support the loan that they needed to build that new terminal. And that new terminal has been the pride of Ghana for some time now. It's allowed us to have more flights coming in and out and has increased revenue for Ghana Airport Authority. So there's no doubt that that sort of self-financing project works for Ghana, and we hope that we can see more of that, and perhaps this paper, as part of the recommendation, can help to point to more of those. So again, non-tax revenue coming from even MMDAs who can generate internally generated funds and support expansion programs amongst themselves. We have seen that whenever there have been windfalls in some industries, especially the extractive industry. Government also benefits from that. So perhaps we want to look at that and enjoy some of that. When we talked about trade facilitation improving and therefore revenue mobilization improving and the process that makes it happen, I agree with Tony again on that. And to be honest, revenue is king in this country. I mean, once you have the revenue, you can tolerate a lot of the issues with expenditure, you can handle your debt repayment. So revenue is king, and therefore I agree that we need to focus seriously on revenue and the kind of personnel that we have in our revenue agencies. He's so right when he says that when you sit with the big boys and they have better resources in terms of legal advice and so forth, they can floor your own people. But I must say that our guys too are not that bad. At least 10 to so years ago, 6 years ago, when I worked with them, they were not too bad, but they could definitely be better improved. Again, also in terms of people and soft issues, we need people who have the values and the mindset that, listen, I can get something out of bringing in the revenue from the government rather than from who I am going after. Because too many times after audits, things fall away. Just because perhaps, okay, just because our people perhaps side more with the wrongdoer than with government who is going after them. And we have many examples of that. I won't go into it. To do with the exemption bill, I have little to say on that, so I'll leave that one for further discussion.
Sorry to do
Thank you. That's okay.
Do you want to say anything on this, or shall we, Ninoy? But just a couple of minutes. Don't.
Okay. Yes. I've been looking at the tax data, and I started a project where I wanted the GRA to link the data to link the data to the GSS, Ghana Statistical Service data, so we can link tax collection to the production base. It's not working. Okay. That way we can then know exactly how much each sector or subsector is contributing to the kitty, and we can go after those who are checking. And I think that project has been started, but I think Tony should find a way to deepen it. Look at this logical conclusion. Yes, we have good people and energetic people who are doing the job. But for me, that is not enough. Mona, you recall that in the year 2013, right after the budget, April, May there, this same room, the other side, Mr. Tepe met the Christian community. And I think Archbishop Pamabakar chaired that function. And in his opening remarks, he threw a challenge to the clergy. He said, look, if the 2020 census is not anything to go by, then 70% of Ghanaians are Christians. And therefore, they must be responsible for our problems. So they should find solutions. And I agree with him. On any given Sunday, we all go and do hallelujah. Monday, we are collecting bribes. So energy and knowledge is not enough. For me, integrity, character might be the order of the day. So if we populate all our agencies with the excellent minds, and they are not committed, they don't have integrity, they use the knowledge to fraud the country. So I don't know how we're going to address this issue by Sekanka. And recently, people came to me, people are not paying their taxes, and they're collecting bribes on that side. I said, then report them. So we are Ghanaians, I can't report them. Then don't come and talk to me about it. No. So GD is a problem. We have to flag it. One of the soft issues. Now again, on the revenue in silos, somehow we've dismembered our revenues not even sufficient into silos, so you have get fund, road fund, this and that. And they all have taken a character of their own. I'm leading the crusade. So now these funds, these statutory funds, should be like funding sources. So if you are located in Ministry of Roads, then the road funds should be used for strategic intervention in the road sector. And here say road maintenance. If it's Ministry of Education, what is the GET fund supposed to be used for? For capital infrastructure in the education sector. So the minister must have an oversight. You cannot let that job to unelected politicians, unelected technocrats who have not been elected, because they don't do the strategic allocation of resources. We technocrats do the allocation by looking at the framework, what fiscal deficit is possible, what debt level is possible. But the actual allocation of resources to the various sectors is a strategic task which has to be done by the elected officials. And I think we have to look at that aspect also. It is when we force them to do the allocation at budget preparation time, then when it comes to the time of execution, we force them to stay within that envelope. Then they can't do and do extra budgetary projects. So that is a commitment control thing, but we'll come back to that during the expenditure time. Okay, so I think with this little intervention, I think the revenues, I'm comfortable with this on what
okay, money I've said. Very good. Now, you would have noticed that in the policy note that was circulated on the revenue side, there's quite a lot of stock put in what can come out of the extractive sector. I think Mona has put some of that in perspective for us in terms of how the extractive sector views things and other contributions they make to growth and so on. We had invited Mr. Kofi Ansan, who used to be the Chief Executive of the Minerals Commission, to share his thoughts with us on the paper. And he wasn't able to join us today, but he sent a note that Ed Brown is going to sort of, just about 5 minutes, just highlight what Kofi says in his note.
Thank you, Chidi. I'm just a messenger. I'm just going to relate what Mr. Kofi Ansa had written in terms of the comments. One is that there is an expectation that the extractive sector would rake in huge amount of resources. He's arguing strongly that this is unfounded. And the reason for this is that if you look at the sources of, revenue mobilization in the sector, you have the royalties that Ms. Quote mentioned, and then you also have the carried interest, and you also have the corporate income taxes. Now, on the royalties, if you benchmark the current level of royalties to some of the best practices in the world, like Australia and South Africa, Ghana's royalties of 5% is much higher. In South Africa, it's about 2.5%, and in Australia, it's about 0.5%. So the extent to which you can push on royalties is going to be very limited in the short term, not even in the medium term. Now, on the issue of carried interest, I think the point he also made is that at the moment it's around 10%. Now, if the government wishes to increase that percentage, it implies some financing from the government. And the government needs to take account of whether it is more expedient to put its marginal dollar or marginal cedi into increasing its carried interest, or to put that expenditures into other areas, such as social programs and so on. So there is currently a trade-off that needs to be done in that area. So I think he was making that point. Now, the other point that he raised is that in period of crisis, the nature of which we have now, sometimes the corporate entities may be prevailed upon to provide some support. But it also depends on the extent to which other sectors, the banking sectors and other sectors, can also be prevailed upon to provide support. So that is also a very difficult part of it. Now, one other issue that you raised, I think, which Ms. Korte mentioned, is the fact that much of the extractive sector industries are not linked into the other parts of the economy, particularly relating to the areas of procurement of equipment, materials, and supplies. And that in many of the countries where the government is getting a lot more revenue, it's related to the indirect effect of the mining sector and the corporates, engaging with the private sector in the countries by procuring most of their goods in the country. Now, for a country like Ghana, where we do not have heavy industries and so on, maybe the equipment area may not be a viable proposition. But at the same time, in terms of the material supplies, which is also very much an area where revenues can be generated, by providing support to specific small and medium-sized enterprises in the sector, they may be able to increase revenue from those areas. So the linkages, the indirect linkages between the corporate entities in the mining sector and the small and medium-sized enterprises in the private sector that will provide supplies and materials and so on is very critical. So these are the three areas that you mentioned, which I thought I could just add to what you said. Yeah.
Great. So let's move on to the expenditure side now. Fred, I think I'm going to start with you and say that, give us your reflections on what the paper says about the Ghana situation, but sort of share with us, what maybe works well in your experience, say from Rwanda, that you think may be applicable here. So I'm giving you a bit of space, and then we'll come to Nino and Mona on some very specific things on the spending side. Fred.
Thank you, Chidi. I think I wouldn't like to waste too much time. I think during the breakout session, we may be able to talk more about some of the issues that have been raised in the paper. But I'll focus on the rigidities, particularly that were mentioned. You have earmarked expenditures, revenue, and which to me is something that has to be looked at seriously. And let me start particularly with the structure of expenditures that we have in Ghana. If I look at the revised 22 fiscal projections, the original had 27% of GDP as total expenditure. So now they have been revised to 22.6% of GDP. But within that structure, you have 6.4% of GDP being allocated for compensation of employees. Now, what does that mean? It means, now, from my knowledge of what we call compensation of employees, you have the salary issues, and then you have the other additions like provision of vehicles, provision of fuel, and provision of accommodation, which are all part of the compensation of employees. Now, the 6.4% of GDP, which I have here, does not maybe show the entire picture. And the Minister of Finance, guys here, can correct me if I'm wrong. So, but in that, you have 6.4% of GDP as compensation of employees. What about the vehicles that are allocated to public servants? What about the fuel? What about accommodation? Where are they? Are they part of the 6.4%, or are they part of it in goods and services, and also under domestic capital? So this, to me, is a serious issue that has to be tackled. Compensation of employees, what does that mean? I think we need to look at the structure of the budget and make sure that if we say compensation of employees,
then it means that we give your money, and we give you your money, and that's it. You find your own accommodation, you buy your own car and maintain it. This is what has been implemented in Rwanda. There is no housing, there's no accommodation, public accommodation for any public servant. There is no car purchase of government for any public servant. You are giving your compensation, and that's it. And that has been able, with the implementation of this policy, the government has been able to reduce the compensation of employees to only 6% of GDP in the fiscal. Only 6% of GDP is the total compensation of employees in Rwanda. This has enabled the government to have more space for other recurrent spending, and most importantly, for capital expenditure. I think that we have to look seriously at compensation of employees and be able to deal with that. One major issue is that it was also able to reduce the corruption. It was also able to reduce the corruption, because anybody who has worked in the Ministry of Finance before can tell you about some of these issues that arise with purchase of cars, provision of accommodation, and purchase maintenance of vehicles and buildings. I think we need to look seriously at compensation of employees, and not to buy vehicles, not to maintain vehicles, not to provide them with petrol. We should look at that seriously. If you go to Rwanda, you will see ministers who drive themselves, who drive their vehicles themselves. The government does not provide any drivers. The government does not provide any drivers for public officials. You see many public officials who drive themselves. The cars they drive are bought by them. The houses in which they live are rented or bought by them. I think this is a very serious issue that we need to look at. And it will therefore be able to provide the fiscal space for other expenditures. This is something that I think I would like to put on the table. And it may need maybe revising the civil service and laws and acts in Parliament, and maybe the parliamentarians should be able to look at that. We need to look at the structure of remuneration in this country. The second item that I would like to highlight is also the earmark. Earmark in Rwanda, that does not exist. We don't have any earmark revenues that are earmarked for public expenditure. What has happened is that within the total budget, there are earmark expenditures. And I'm sorry to say that a lot of the earmark expenditures, the laws governing the earmark expenditures, were borrowed from Ghana. Many of the laws, like capitation grant, many of the laws regarding capitation grant, District Assembly Common Fund, they were borrowed from Ghana, including the procurement law. I think anybody who is conversant with the Rwanda procurement law, you can just remove the name Rwanda and put the Ghana there, or the Ghana one, remove the Ghana one and put Rwanda there. the procurement, a lot of the laws governing earmark expenditures were borrowed from Ghana, but there are no earmark revenues for that. But within the structure of expenditures, there are all these social safety net expenditures, like the capitation grant I've mentioned, school feeding, the District Assembly Common Fund I've mentioned, and also the road fund. And I would like to dwell on the road fund in particular. That the road fund that is in the petroleum price build-up that is collected as revenue does not come under the Accountant General. It is a special fund that is allocated in the central bank, and there's a board that manages that special fund. So if you go to Rwanda, you will see the potholes on the road because the board does not depend on the Accountant General to release funds for the board to maintain roads. Once the money accrues to the account, the board therefore utilizes this road fund to maintain roads. And therefore, it is able to have the funds to deal with road maintenance. So this something that I think we can also emulate here. The third aspect of expenditure that I want to mention before we break up to the real session is the definition of the deficit. The definition of the deficit. There are so many definitions of the deficit, but I would like to highlight one particular definition of the deficit because it has implications for our current situation, which is the debt. Now, given that the debt is of paramount importance to Rwanda, it has therefore designed an IMF program which targets what we call new debt creating deficit. New debt creating deficit. What does that mean? What it means is that if you are borrowing some funds, external funds, to implement a road project costing, let's say, $100 million US, which is going to be implemented over a 5-year period. So you design your fiscal program that will accommodate the $100 million loan that you are going to borrow, but it means that it goes into your sustainability studies ante. But then, since you are going to draw down 5-year period, over a 5-year period, in the year 1, your deficit will include that drawdown amount that you have. Okay, so in terms of your debt, it does not add to your debt as you come to year 2, year 3, year 4. So it means that as you go along the year, your deficit will be the only will be defined as the only the deficit that will create a new debt. That will create new debt. This has allowed the government to have a debt sustainability profile, which says that they will not exceed the threshold of 70% of GDP, which gives you into the unsustainable debt level period. But then what it also means is that if you are able to collect more tax or non-tax revenue within that year, you can also spend it because it does not create new debt. I think that we may need to, in our negotiation with the IMF, try to see how we can borrow some of these definitions, which will help in making sure that we have a program that is manageable and also does not increase our debt levels. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I think we're sort of running out of time, so I'm going to suggest that we just take one more topic. I'll pose the questions, and then we'll do the breakout sections where we can dive a bit deeper into some of these topics. So, Nino and Mona, we have all these laws, public financial management, fiscal responsibility, and yet, I mean, we are reading from the Auditor General's report that there's all this spending happening. People are not using IFMAs and all of that. I mean, why is it that we are not using the systems that we've invested so much in establishing? I mean, can you sort of speak a little bit to issues around commitment control or the lack of it, I suppose? Extra budgetary spending leading to arrears, use and non-use of gift maize, and so on. So, Dino, do you want to set the ball rolling, and then Mona will...
Yeah.
10 minutes. We have 10 minutes.
Yes, and my blunt answer to is we don't apply the sanctions.
Okay. Yeah. So
The laws have inbuilt sanctions for violating them. And somehow do the scratch my back, scratch your back, we don't apply the sanctions. If we apply the sanctions as, can you hear me? If you apply the sanctions as enshrined in law, and people get booked and charged, whether in monetary terms or a combination of monetary and jail terms, I'm sure this will be a thing of the past. Now, when you come to the compensation thing, though, let me just draw on that one now. We have a lot of labor agitation that pays are not enough and this and that. But by the same token, we have a huge chunk of our revenues going to compensation. It is a micro issue. What does it mean? It means your public sector workforce is bloated because you are spreading yourself too thin over a large number of people who say they are not being paid well. Is it time now that we have to look at pruning the size and paying them well, getting people who are more qualified, paying them well so that they can do the job? If you go to come to the ministry, a lot of people moving around doing nothing. Because over time, we've padded the workforce. And they're not doing the critical job they have to do, but we are paying them. And they say the pay is not enough, so they go to the streets. So we have to look at what is in compensation and who are there. Now, the other issue about what is revenue when we come to the budgeting. Your oil revenue, the upstream oil revenue, is split three ways. One for the petroleum funds for savings, stabilization, and heritage, and then the one for GNPC to continue exploration, then the one going to government, the APFA. And as the name suggests, annual budget funding amount to support the budget. The last time I looked, the APFA portion of the budget actual revenue to support the budget about 8% of the total revenue. So it's not that much. So it is the non-oil sector which still leads in terms of revenue collections. And if we don't build the non-oil sector to generate revenue, you are not going to go anywhere. Now, so if you take the statutory funds and all those earmark funds aside, you only have about 66% of the revenues to do compensation, to do interest payments. Once you do the two, they are not even, this 66% is not even enough to cater for compensation and interest combined. And 2020, for instance, we have to borrow about 50% more to bridge that gap, and then the rest of borrowing for capex and goods and services. You cannot continue that way. It will not bring your debt down. If you borrow to pay interest, you're in dire straits. So we'll we'll look at all these issues in granular detail when we meet at the breakout sessions. So Chidi, this is a snapshot of where we are.
Thank you, Chidi. I'm sure KY was very happy to hear what Ninoy said. And to be honest, today Ninoy is the man after my heart. Because he said it. I mean, there are sanctions in these laws. What's happening with them? If we just look at the vote of censure that went from the parliamentarians in Parliament, the list of things that were there, including bypassing the give me system, using District's Assembly Common Fund for things that it should not be used for. I mean, it's obvious that we are not sanctioning according to those laws, and that must be enforced. So I agree with him completely on that. When it comes to the area of discussing how these deficits are defined, as mentioned by Fred, I also want to talk about the way that we are becoming creative as a nation with the way we account for things. I mean, there are internationally accepted practices, consistency in how we do things and all that. And I don't know how we can then get so creative that we are able to show above line and below line and then get busted, as it were, for what our true debt is and if it is indeed sustainable. So those are some of the things that we all need to learn to try and follow those principles and do what we have to do. My last point will be on specific projects, and I like what Fred talked about on the road fund and how that fund is managed. And that's what I try to bring out in there, allowing some MMDAs to use their AGFs to build up. I think that how we allocate resources is going to be very important. It's no longer only about the elected officers, but the Ghanaians have to also be part of that. And therefore, I like the idea about using perhaps this platform to help NDPC to plan for the long term and making sure that any party at all that comes to power also feeds into that mutually agreed and owned planning thing. Because honestly, when we look at some of the statutory areas that we pay monies to from our budget today, Get Fund, Road Fund, all of them, we really need to start discussing today what is priority. What are those specific targeted areas that we want to grow in today's world, and then be able to allocate funds to them? Because in as much as we say we don't like earmarking, there has to be some level of earmarking. I mean, if you don't earmark, certain areas will fail. So you will have to do some of that. But which ones you choose and how you allocate to them is going to be very important. So those are my comments on the expenditure side. Thank you, Chidi.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Mavis, but just in terms of a bit of guidance for the break. Yeah. Tony has to go. Yeah. So thank you very much. Sorry.
I just thought that I should make a couple of comments.
Okay. And
with your kind permission, I will just give you some specific examples, because the extractives is an area I have grown to have an interest in. Chatham House rules, right? Bauxite mine. In 10 years, government has 20% carry interest. In 10 years, they declare a profit once. So 9 out of 10 years, no profit declared. They triple almost 2.5 times their production over that period of time. So they are not making a profit, and they are increasing production. Government is earning 0 from its carried interest, 20% interest. They have excellent relationships in the community they operate because they do good CSR. School here, toilet here, a scholarship here, you know. What's my point? CSR, we should not allow CSR to replace tax revenue. And the people we are dealing with, they know better than us. They even understand the Ghanaian psyche better than we know it ourselves. The board has 2 or 3 Ghanaian members. What is their role as board members sitting on this multinational board overseeing this company? Who is their responsibility to? And over the 10 years, through different administrations, different board members, and one board member has the contract to bus the workers back and forth. Another board member supplies water or something, you know. And this is real example I'm talking about. So we need the extractives. They are smarter than we are. So the people we put on the board, fortunately, Mona will not sit on such a board, definitely, and not get involved in that kind of thing. But when I take a look at the qualifications of the people who are sitting on the board, I wonder if I would put them on the board of my company. So how do they end up on such a board? We need to get into the details of some of these things. Another true example, another mine, insure equipment, get an insurance claim, and then the claim is paid overseas. It does not reflect in the accounts of the company locally, which is against all accounting rules and regulations and financial reporting. And so obviously the company's profits are because I'm talking of hundreds of millions of dollars, and they are not reflected locally. So to do this kind of investigation, the kind of resources and the kind of people you need to do it, people who can tap their global network, people who can see what they are reporting to their shareholders elsewhere. Because really, if some of these companies were not making substantial returns, they would not be raising the capital that they are using here. But I'm giving you these examples just to let us know that when it comes to non-tax revenue, we have not given it the attention we should. And it is important. I'm glad that it came up. We should look at non-tax revenue very, very carefully. The next thing is that in revenue generation, sometimes the political economy matters seem to override everything else. GRA starts an invigilation exercise. We say that even before we can do the electronic VAT thing, we put a core of people out there and say, just check everybody coming out of the shop. Have they been given a VAT receipt, or is VAT reflected on this thing? And in the 1 month that the exercise is done, the companies who were targeted, their revenue is double what they have reported for each of the previous 3 months. In fact, in some cases, in the case of one restaurant who had been reporting 20%, 20,000 cedis in July, 26,000 cedis in August, and then 25 in June, July, August. When we put an invigilationist there in September, it's 300,000 cedis. That's their revenue. So you can imagine what the losses are, you know. Then immediately this comes up, you have a traders group come up immediately, and they are on radio and they are everywhere, and they are just making life uncomfortable for our political friends who are government who have to run this thing, and they come to us and say, what is this you are doing which is causing all this confusion in the town? So where really is our national interest? Do we go after them to collect the revenue or not? Yesterday I just received October VAT returns, and it's a considerable improvement over the previous 9 months of the year, just because of this exercise which is started. Can you go ahead? So there are political economy things which we have to look at. It's not just the laws. The laws are there, but implementation of the laws, there are issues which are bigger than the revenue authority, you know. I just end this thing with just one thing. A young lady called Ama Penny, a PhD student, did some work on how much tithes and offerings that Pentecostal churches in Ghana, not the traditional churches, collect. And I'll give you the reference, Gidi. She came to the conclusion that Pentecostal churches collect 3% of GDP. Yes, as tithe and offering. 3% of GDP. I mean, if we had 3% more of GDP as revenue, we will be at 16%. We wouldn't be having any of these problems we are having. And who do they account to? They are tax-free organizations. They get away. But my point, what I really want to say is that maybe in fashioning revenue collection methods, you know, maybe we should look at different models. I mean, if we went to these people and said, now we don't pay tax, but we will make you a revenue collection agency. And whatever you collect from your people. Can you collect the same amount for us too? And see if we can put, we need new forms of thinking, because our country and the whole political economy of this country is an unusual one. Finally, I agree with what Fred said. Okay. Our definitions of debt, we will need to look at it, because there are a whole lot of revenue sources, I mean, which don't come into which are not. Mm-hmm. So we need to look again at what our definitions are. Some fundamental work is required. Thank you very much.
Great. So it's a case of giving unto Caesar what is Caesar's, right? Yeah. Okay, great. So just by way of guidance for the breakout sessions, we would like you to focus very much on the recommendations. I mean, it's fine to expand the list of challenges, but if you do that, please also discuss recommendations and highlight ones that can be implemented in the short term. Thank you very much. I'll turn over to Mavis.
Thank you very much. Could we give them a round of applause? They've done an excellent job. I know a number of you had questions for the panelists, but unfortunately we've run out of time. But the panelists will be in the sessions with us, so if you have a chance to join them, it would be great. But before we leave for the breakout sessions, a couple of things. KY, you wanted to do some welcomes before we break up, so over to you.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. Do you hear me? Yeah. In my opening remark, yeah. I'm in my. Maybe I better use the other one. Yeah. Yeah. In In my opening remarks, I mentioned that this consultation is being held in partnership with the Finance Committee of Parliament in light of its importance, how timely it is, and also the sense that we want to portray of bipartisanship in these discussions. So I'm very glad that the ranking member of the Finance Committee, Mr. Tuforson, has joined us now. Kweku, yeah, and Kweku Kwating, the chair, will also be joining us. And after the breakout sessions, when we come to the plenary session, I'll give them a chance to make a few remarks so that we can go. Also, I mentioned the collaboration we've been having with the Council of State, and I'm glad that my friend and brother, the chairman of the Council of State, and when I say my friend and brother, it's really so. I won't tell you the whole story now, but they've been very gracious, worked with us, we've addressed them 4 times, and their support, as I mentioned, throughout has been great. So Nana is here with us also, so if he has anything to say later, we're giving him the opportunity. He says it's okay. So I just wanted to thank you, Atu, for coming. And we look forward to seeing Kweku, and then we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, KY. Can you hear me? Okay, so now we're going to go into our breakout session, and it's going to be, as they say, there's no coffee for free anywhere. So there is coffee and snacks outside, and what I'd like to suggest is you grab a coffee and a snack if you'd like one before you go into the breakout room. Now, you've all registered for which breakout room you want, the breakout group you want to be part of. So what I'd like to explain is where you are actually going to be for your session. So those of you who are going to domestic revenue mobilization discussion, that session will be chaired by Dr. Said Boache. Said, could you stand up, please? Thank you. And you will be in room number 2. If you come out, take a left, you'll see room number 2 on your right. So take a right. No, don't say it's because I'm female. It's not. I just have bad directions. It has nothing to do with my sex. So my gender. So if you come out, you take a right, it will be room number 2 on your left. So the rooms are on your left. So that's for domestic revenue mobilization. Those of you who are working on expenditure management, you will be in this room, and your chair will be Dr. Ebo Texan. Ebo, do you mind standing? Oh, I'm so sorry. Professor Ebo Texan. Okay. And for those of you who signed up to debt sustainability, you will be in room number 3, which again, out of the door to your right, opposite on your left, room number 3, and your chair will be Kofi. I don't see Kofi in the room. Kofi Bensi. Okay, so in Kofi's absence, this session will be facilitated by Dr. Ed Brown. Sorry, Ed, I've made a decision. Is that okay? Thank you very much. Okay. So, and if you've forgotten which group you signed up to, the list is outside with all your names on it. So thank you very much. Enjoy your coffee break. And, sorry. You have 1 hour for the discussion, but if it's really impassioned and exciting, you can go out, grab your lunch, and continue discussing over lunch. We are all meeting back in this room at 2 o'clock. Please, we are meeting back in this room at 2 o'clock. So you have roughly an hour for discussion and 45 minutes for lunch break if you want a lunch break. And we are meeting back at 2 o'clock. Thank you very much.
just quickly go around the table first to get some insights, any comments on the recommendations, and also the observations that were made at the plenary session, you know, with the panelists and so on. If you have any observations relating to debt sustainability.
Okay.